Hey everyone, it's Miss Tennessee. I apologize. It's taken me a couple of days to get the Chapter 7 and 11 review to you, but I'm going to go ahead and get through that now. This one may be a little longer. I'll try to move quickly, but there's a lot of stuff that comes up from especially the memory chapter, Chapter 7 on the AP exam. So I'll go ahead and get started there. So if you grab your review guides on memory, the Chapter 7 review guide, to start out, I'm going to kind of skip over the first almost half page because I have a strong feeling that we all understand encoding and storage retrieval, long-term, short-term memory. I do want to remind you what working memory is. Remember, working memory is kind of the newer understanding of your short-term memory. So working memory is basically taking in new information and then accessing at the same time memory stored in the long term to help you make sense of that new incoming information. So if you look there in your notes, you have the visual for working memory. It shows you either hear things or you see things, and the way that that central executive, which is you, takes in that new information, uses the long term to make sense, and kind of encode and store that new information through the short term of the working memory. But moving on to encoding memory. So when we talk about memory, we focus on the two types, explicit and implicit. So explicit, also known as declarative memories. Remember, these are going to be things like on the AP exam, they're probably going to ask about specifically semantic, episodic, or what's called perspective memory. So just real quick, semantic, remember that's just going to be meaning, names, facts. Those are going to be your semantic memories, things that you learn like in school, states and capitals, addresses, phone numbers. Episodic memories are memories of events, things like, games or prom or whatever, having memories of things that have happened that are episodes in your life. Perspective memory, we didn't talk about. Perspective memory is not in your textbook. It actually has come up, I guess, on two different occasions on FRQs. I can't remember exactly when that was. That's okay. But this is perspective memory is your memory to carry something out in the future, meaning you have a task that you need to complete at a later time and remembering to do that. For example, remembering that you need to study for a test that you have, remembering that you need to pick up dry cleaning or you need to stop at the store and get milk. This is what we call perspective memory. It is a type of explicit, and it's recall, which this is perspective memory declines as we age, much as recall does. So this is why people use calendars, reminders, Post-it notes, because oftentimes that perspective memory, unless we have some type of a cue, we tend to forget those things. So that's what your perspective memory is. It has been on the AP exam twice in the last 10 years. So just something to make sure that you understand and that you know. Then we talk about implicit. Implicit has come up. And it has also come up twice, but they call it procedural memory. So when you're looking at implicit, think implicit, procedural. Those are your muscle memory type things. And we'll talk about those more here in a couple minutes. But so implicit, explicit, make sure that you know the difference. Automatic versus effortful processing. So with your explicit things like remembering names or remembering facts, or even what happened at, your friend's birthday party. Those are all things that require effort, meaning if someone asks you about it, it requires your effort to be able to recall those things, or you had to actually be consciously focused on and paying attention to something that happened at your friend's birthday party, for example. Where the automatic processing, those things that we process into memory without any thought. Okay, so how many times we saw our friend in the hallway at school, or where the term is that we're trying to remember on a test, where it is, in our notes or in our textbook. Okay, so that's the difference in effortful and automatic. Going on to the next page, remember when we talk about sensory memory, iconic is visual, echoic is hearing. So echoic, that's hearing. Iconic is much shorter. Remember when you see things that something flashes on a screen like Sperling did in his study with the lines of letters, you only can hold on to that information for about a 20th of a second. You don't have, I'm sorry, not a 20th, a few tenths of a second. He flashed it for a 20th of a second. You have a few tenths of a second before, unless you start to rehearse that, it's gone. So that is your iconic. Your echoic, remember, you can hold on to about 3 to 4 seconds. When you're not consciously paying attention and someone is speaking to you, and then they say, hey, are you listening to me? Did you hear what I just said? You can grab about 3 to 4 seconds. That's your echoic. Now, going into short term, remember the rule for short term memory is the magic number is 7. We can usually hold on to somewhere between 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information, 5 to 9 things. Remember, as we did that test of your short-term memory in class with the strings of numbers, the more numbers, the harder it gets. So that's your short term. And then when we talk about processing and that effortful processing and how do we get things from short term into long term, they have asked on the AP exam about chunking and just mnemonics in general. So remember, a mnemonic is just any memory aid. Chunking is specifically a way to remember information by, breaking it down into smaller, more meaningful units, the way we do with phone numbers, social security numbers. Roy G. Biv was one of the examples that we used in class. So those are things that they may ask about. Imagery is another one they have alluded to on FRQs recently. When we visualize, it makes it easier to remember. And we did some activities like that in class where one side of the class was using, what we call, and I'm moving forward a little bit, shallow processing, just counting, is there the letter E in this word, or looking at just surface stuff, versus the deep processing groups who were trying to visually picture or make something meaningful. When we use visual imagery, that is a type of mnemonic, like a peg word system, the method of loci. Don't spend your time trying to memorize what all of these different mnemonics are, but as long as you remember mnemonics and how they help us remember and help us encode. They have asked 3 times about distributed practice. This should be a piece of cake, and let's hope they ask about distributed practice, also known as the spacing effect. So we talked about this. We talked about how we want to space out or distribute our study time into several smaller, chunks of time instead of cramming everything in the night before. So they have asked about that on 3 different occasions. So that's something to make sure that you are familiar with. I already just talked about the shallow versus deep processing. Remember, deep processing, it's just called semantic encoding things with meaning. Making things meaningful helps us encode them and helps us retain that information better. So in the long run, we use semantic or deep processing, we will remember more information. All right, on to the next page. Looking at the actual brain, I put the image in there, all the parts of the brain that play a role in memory. So we'll start with explicit, that's your frontal lobes, and that is your hippocampus. So remember, the frontal lobes are really at work when we take in new information. That working memory is really getting going in the frontal lobes, but your hippocampus is kind of like that loading dock. That is where we process and store all of our information. So when we get damage there, which is what we see a lot with people who suffer with Alzheimer's, people who have some form of amnesia, they have a deterioration of tissue there, or if there's damage in that intertemporal lobe area where the hippocampus is located, that's when we start to see loss of memory for things, like words, faces, names. It just depends sometimes on if the damage is on the left or the right side. Implicit, remember, those are memories we typically don't lose with forms of amnesia or Alzheimer's. Those are your muscle memories. That is your procedural memory. I'll say that again. Implicit is the same as procedural memory. They will probably use the term procedural memory on an FRQ. So please make sure that you know that is just another word for implicit memory. And that's your cerebellum and the basal ganglia. Cerebellum, remember, is a lot of those classically conditioned memories, things like the dog salivating automatically to the bell. Basal ganglia plays a role in a lot of the more motor movements. But when you think implicit procedural memory, think of walking, talking, riding a bike, playing an instrument, etc. Remember the role the amygdala plays with emotion. Obviously, flashbulb memories, how your stress hormones play a role in forming those more vivid, strong memories. And also make sure that you can relate that to repression and how it basically argues that repression is not real or is not possible. Just wanted to throw that in there real quick to make sure that we don't forget that. And they have also asked about, unfortunately, long-term potentiation. Long-term potentiation, remember, that is the actual strengthening of those neural connections as we form memories. So this is where we talked about the sea slug. And because sea slugs only have about 10,000 brain cells, so they can actually see the strengthening of those synaptic connections. But what happens in the brain of humans is we're born, remember, with all of those brain cells that we're ever going to have. And as we learn and we form memories, we practice a skill. Let's say you are learning to play the guitar. At first, that's really difficult and it takes a lot of effort. But as you start playing, you start to form stronger connections in the brain, so that you get to the point you can pick up your guitar and you can start playing, and it becomes much easier. Well, that's because what's happened in the brain is those synaptic connections dedicated to that memory have gotten stronger. Okay. And remember, glutamate is that neurotransmitter that helps foster that long-term potentiation. It kind of feeds and helps form memory. So make sure you know that as well. There's also, I put there that little flow chart just so you kind of look over that for your difference in implicit and explicit, the types of memories they are. Moving on to the next page, they have asked about both context and state-dependent memory. State-dependent has actually been on there twice. Sometimes they will use those two terms interchangeably, but I'll just remind you from class, context-dependent, that was the example of you're in the kitchen and you need to go upstairs and get your backpack from your bedroom. You get up to your bedroom and then you forgot why you're there. Okay. You get back to the kitchen, you're back in that same context where you had that memory, and now you remember that you needed your backpack. Where state dependent is more about your state of consciousness. You're about to go to sleep, you're really tired, but you remember, oh, tomorrow I can't forget to get my homework off the printer. You're probably not going to remember it until you're in that same state of consciousness again. Okay, so that's why we want to write things down if we're going to sleep and we're really tired, because we may not remember those things again until we're in that same state. Serial position effect has been asked about. That is just simply when we are retrieving information, we are better at remembering the first and last items on the list. We call that the recency and primacy effect. So the first items is the primacy. First things we heard, recency is remembering those last items on the list. And then forgetting. So one of the things that's commonly confused is the two types of amnesia: anterograde and retrograde. Anterograde, remember, that's your 51st states example. You can't form new memories after the onset of the amnesia, whether that's from a car accident, a stroke, whatever causes the amnesia. With anterograde, you cannot form new memories. Retrograde, that's like the movie The Vow. That's where you lose memory for things that happened in your past. So if you can remember that retro means old, can't remember old memories, that may help. But that's the difference. Try to make sure that you don't confuse the two. Encoding failure has also come up a couple of times. Remember why we fail to encode? Like when I showed you all the picture in class, it had like 6 different options of what the penny looks like. You know, Abraham Lincoln's face, is it facing left or right? Where's the date? What are the words at the top or the bottom, etc.? Well, most of us couldn't get that right. Some of us guessed and we're lucky, but we've never actually paid attention to the exact, layout of the design of the penny. Therefore, we have suffered what we would call encoding failure. Encoding failure simply happens because we don't actually pay attention to the details. We fail to encode things that the teacher says right there in class while we're sitting there, but we are checking a text message on our phone. We weren't paying attention. Encoding failure happens because of selective attention, which we talked about in chapter 4, but make sure that you understand why sometimes, information, even though we know that's a penny, we can't tell you which one is the correct penny because we've never actually encoded that information. Looking at the forgetting curve too, remember, storage decay happens. Sometimes we learn things and then we forget because we don't use that information. Remember, forgetting happens very rapidly at first. I took Spanish or French. I stopped using it for a long period of time. I'm going to rapidly forget most of that information, but then it's going to level off. Okay. But make sure coding failure, that one has been on a couple of FRQs recently, as has proactive and retroactive interference. Both of those have come up multiple times. So good chance you may need your good old acronym porn on the FRQ. Just in case you forgot, we'll go through it again. I put it there for you, but remember how the acronym works. Proactive is when the old information interferes with your ability to remember new information. So proactive, we can't remember the new information because the old information is interfering. So proactive would be, for example, I had to change my password to log into my email, and all of a sudden I can't remember my new password because the old one keeps interfering. I keep entering my old password, interfering with me remembering that new one. Where retro, again, retro means you can't remember old information. So if the acronym is confusing to you, retro, just like in retrograde amnesia, retroactive interference, new information is doing the interfering. So you can't recall the old information. So for example, I'm filing my taxes and I lived in 2 different places in 2019, but I have my new address now and I can't recall what my old address was. So that new information is interfering with my ability to recall the old information. Okay. Proactive, the old is interfering, so I can't remember new. Retroactive, the new is interfering, so I can't recall old. Okay. Please know those because they come up more often than you would think. Okay. Moving on to memory construction. So when we talk about misinformation, Elizabeth Loftus, she did the study with the car accident. Why do people misremember? A lot of that is the way questions are framed. So we'll talk about framing again here in a few minutes, but framing is also can affect memory construction. When we frame questions in a way to mislead people or cause them to misremember, like with the car accident, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other versus when they hit one another. It causes people to misremember. Source amnesia, also known as source misattribution, and I put them both on there for you because in the past they have both come up and they've used both terms. Well, it's the same term. It's come up, but it's come up in both ways. So in some FRQs, they've used source amnesia, and others they said source misattribution. Either way, remember that's just when you can't remember the source of your memory. I gave you my personal example of the Bengals game where the fan jumps out and takes the ball away from Brett Favre. I couldn't remember, was I actually at that game? Did I see it in person? Did I watch it on TV? Did someone just tell me about it? Was it a dream? These are all things that happen to people when we misremember or we forget I know I have this memory, but I'm not sure where it came from. Okay. So that's either source amnesia or source misattribution. They mean the same thing. So you may see one or the other. They've used both. Moving down to thinking creatively, both convergent and divergent thinking have come up. Remember, convergent is more of that IQ test, taking a math test. We're searching for one single solution to a problem. Where divergent is you're more being able to think of multiple solutions to a problem, to make sure that you know the difference there. On the next page, algorithm and heuristic have both come up when it comes to problem solving. Remember, an algorithm is a step-by-step, very methodical procedure that leads us to the correct answer. It takes a lot longer, where a heuristic is a much faster problem-solving approach, but we're much more likely to make an error or make a mistake. Obstacles to problem solving, confirmation bias, and I'll believe perseverance will come up later, but confirmation bias, remember, that's when and this is happening a lot right now, all of the different, kind of takes on COVID and wearing masks and social distancing and everything that's going on. We see a lot of confirmation bias, especially on social media, where people will seek out the evidence that supports what they believe. Okay, then they'll post articles or they'll quote things or videos. But we're seeking out evidence to confirm our bias or our belief. So that is confirmation bias. This can really, kind of blind us to seeing the other side of an argument when we're only seeking out evidence that will confirm our beliefs. So if we only watch one media outlet that only reports news, in a liberal or a conservative way, etc. Mental sets, remember, a mental set is just your inability to see a problem from a new or a fresh perspective. So two types of mental sets are going to be fixation, and then the one that has come up on the AP exam is functional fixedness. And we put this in our notes this year. I do not believe it's in your textbook, but I also put that picture, which I thought was pretty funny. I don't know, you guys probably saw that on the internet. I think I actually retweeted it. But the man who clearly didn't have a face mask, so he has a maxi pad over his face, functional fixedness. Again, we're seeing a lot of that now. I've seen people, actually just the other day, saw two people at Kroger dressed up in those big inflatable dinosaur costumes. So no face mask, people are putting on costumes, people are using bandanas, like finding a way to avoid functional fixedness. So remember, functional fixedness is when we can't see an item beyond for what its intended use is. But when we avoid functional fixedness, we are able to use that divergent thinking and think more creatively, and use something like a maxi pad for a face mask. So forming judgments, availability heuristic and representativeness heuristic have both been on FRQs recently. I know that these give people trouble, just like the interferences give people trouble. So I put an example of availability heuristic on there for you. It's the couple sitting on the beach, talking about the people in the water having a death wish. So remember, availability is what is most available in our memory. We tend to overestimate or misjudge things based on our most available memories. Things like shark attacks. We hear that someone was attacked by a shark off the coast of Florida, let's say, and now we overestimate how likely it is that we might get attacked by a shark if we go in the ocean, when in reality, it's a very, very rare and small chance that would happen. But because of that availability heuristic, we misjudge. Same thing with people who are afraid to fly. People hear about a plane crash, and now all of a sudden they overestimate how likely it is that a plane is actually going to crash. And so they avoid flying when really driving in the car is much more dangerous. Representativeness heuristic, that's that judgment that we make based on our prototype. How well does something match or fit our prototype? A lot of people think of representative heuristic like stereotyping, which I guess it can be like that, but I gave you the example. Actually, this one was in your book. If you've got a man described as, wearing glasses and sweater vests and, liking to read poetry, and then asked, is he more likely a truck driver or a college professor? In our minds, that fits our prototype of a college professor more so than a truck driver. Same thing, someone comes in and they're really tall, then we may assume that they play basketball, where we may assume someone who's shorter does not. Okay, how well does something fit your prototype? That's the representativeness heuristic. Both heuristics, meaning we often make an error in judgment. It's a quick problem-solving technique, but we often make mistakes. Please make sure if you have questions about those, ask. We're going to talk tonight, hopefully at 8:30. So if any of this is still confusing, let me know. Belief perseverance has also come up. This is often confused with confirmation bias. See this happening now too. Belief perseverance, and this has come up multiple times in recent FRQs, is just clinging to your beliefs. Okay, you're not seeking out evidence, but you just continue to believe whatever you believe, even when there's contradicting evidence, even when, somebody says, that what you believe is inaccurate, or they present evidence that maybe would discredit what you believe. You just cling to, or those beliefs persevere. That is belief perseverance. So that's where you get the difference. Confirmation bias, we seek out evidence to confirm our beliefs. Belief perseverance, we just cling to those beliefs. Okay, moving on to language. Phonemes have come up, but I want to make sure you know the difference between phonemes and morphemes. So phonemes are the smallest sound unit in language. So this is going to be the letters of the alphabet, as well as there are about 40 in the English language, as well as letter pairs that make sounds like the word chat, C-H-A-T. You have 3 phonemes. The C-H make a sound, the A and the T. Where morphemes are the smallest unit that carry meaning. So these are going to be things like a prefix or a suffix. Adding an ED to the end of the word changes its meaning. But there are some phonemes that are also morphemes. So like if you had the word, I think we had the word bats in class. Okay, there are 2 morphemes there. The word bat carries meaning. Then the S on the end, not only is that a phoneme because it also has its own sound, but it's a morpheme because it changes the meaning from one single bat to multiple bats. It makes it plural. So semantics, syntax, again, semantics, same thing in memory. In our language, semantics is just meaning. Syntax is word order. How do we structure sentences so that they make sense? They have asked about language acquisition as well. What I want to point out, I went ahead and put the chart in there for you with babbling to 1 word to 2 word. But remember that receptive language is being able to understand. So if they ask you about receptive language, they're just asking about being able to hear, listen, and understand or comprehend. Babies can receive and understand language much sooner than they can produce it. They're like animals, dogs. When I talk to my dogs, they have receptive language. They understand certain words. They don't have any productive language. Productive language starts with that 1 word stage when babies actually start to speak words that have, meaning, allow them to communicate. That is productive. So remember, babbling is not productive. It is just babies making noises. Productive language starts with that 1 word stage. It's when they can actually produce language. Just quickly with Noam Chomsky, basically what he said is we're all pre-wired to learn language at birth, and that we all share a universal grammar. So no matter who you are, what your genetics are, where you're born, what country, who your parents are, you are pre-wired to learn language, and we all are able to learn any language because we share a universal grammar up to a point. Remember that critical period we talked about with languages about the age of 7. If children do not learn a language by 7, they may not learn language at all. Or if you start taking, Spanish or French or German in your, teenage years, it's why it's much harder for you to learn it and speak it because you've passed that critical period. I know that these were in chapter 3, but again, while we're talking about language, just want to make mention of Broca's and Wernicke's. Broca's was just on last year's FRQ. You can see those most definitely. Don't forget, they are both on the left side of the brain. All of your language is left. Broca's is production of language, and Wernicke's is comprehension. Moving down, so let's move into the intelligence stuff. That'll wrap up. I'll stop with the chapter 7 there and move into what is chapter 11. But they combine these two now in AP Psych. So I put the chart there for you. I didn't want to have you spend time writing all that stuff out, but do make sure you know the difference in kind of the theories that we have one general level of intelligence. Like Spearman thought we all just kind of, if you're good at one thing, you're probably good at others as well. Mental abilities. Thurstone said, no, we all have different mental abilities. And he laid out like 7 different mental abilities. Thurstone's not as important. But 2 that really are important are the multiple intelligence guys, and that's Gardner. Remember, he had 8 multiple intelligences, and then Sternberg. And with Sternberg, he just had 3. And they have asked recently about practical intelligence. So his 3 were analytical, which that's your academic, your IQ, creative, which we talked about, divergent thinking and creative intelligence, but then practical. Practical intelligence is it's similar, not the same, but very similar to having emotional intelligence. Being able to manage people, being able to function day to day, take care of yourself, correspond through email, do very simple like tasks that, allow us to, not just communicate, but like kind of function in society well. You almost think of practical intelligence like your street smarts, but that has come up. So just be aware of that. Moving on to the next, make sure, I think we all are good on the difference in achievement and aptitude tests. Achievement is what the AP exam would be, testing what you have already learned. Aptitude is testing your future performance. I forgot to put something in here. So if you have your notes with you, I hope you do. Add the Flynn effect, please. I don't know why I forgot to put it in here. I apologize. I was really trying to shorten things up for you, but make sure you know what the Flynn effect is. Remember, that was that chart that showed IQ scores increasing over time, how much higher they are today than they were, 50, 60 years ago. And the whole point is that it is the change in our environment today. The increase in IQ scores has nothing to do with genetics. It all has to do with difference in education, technology, the number of kids that people are having, nutrition, things like that. That is going to be why we see an increase in IQ scores today from the past. Looking at test construction, make sure you know, I know the normal curve, understand, what that 68% is. That's the number of scores within one standard deviation, both above and below the mean, and then the 95%. This might come up on that second question when they start asking about statistics. So this overlaps into chapter 2 in statistics, but just making sure you understand the meaning of the normal curve when all those measures of central tendency fall right there in the middle, the center. And that is when our scores will neatly fall within that normal, bell-shaped curve. So look over that. I put that in there for you so you have it. But I would just make sure you remember what those percentages actually mean. But I do also want to make sure we know reliability and validity, because again, those could very well come up on that second question. So making sure you understand the difference. Reliability is just consistency. Are your scores reliable means are they consistent? So let's say I'm taking a graduate entrance exam, and I took one that Xavier required, but then I had to take it again for UC. Were my scores similar? If I test and I retest, are my scores similar? That is reliability. Are they consistent? Okay, so ways to test reliability, like I just said, you can test and then retest, or you can do what's called a split half, where you give, if I wanted to do this with one of our tests, I could give half of you, even questions, half of you the odds, split the test in half, compare the results. Do they correlate? Yes. Then we would say it's reliable. But reliable doesn't mean valid. Okay, so they are not the same thing. Validity is, does the test measure or predict what it's supposed to? Okay, for example, here's why they're not the same. Let's just say I have a measuring tape and it's 2 inches off, but I use it to measure everyone's height. Okay, is it reliable? Am I going to get consistent results? Well, yes, but are they valid? No. Is it measuring what it's supposed to? No, because it's 2 inches off. I hope that makes sense. So validity, 2 types. Content is, does the test measure what it's supposed to? Where predictive validity is, how well does it predict what it's supposed to? For example, with the ACT, predictive validity has come up on a couple FRQs. With the ACT, it's predictive validity we want. With aptitude tests, we are looking for predictive validity. How well does it predict your performance your freshman year of college, for example, the ACT? Okay, where content validity would be like this AP exam. How well does this predict, how well does this measure your knowledge of psychology? Okay, so we want, with achievement tests, to have content validity. With aptitude tests, we want predictive validity. Moving on, make sure you also, these are the last 2 things, make sure you know the difference of crystallized and fluid intelligence. These were really important when we talked about aging and intelligence. Remember, crystallized is just, that's the intelligence of accumulated knowledge. Crystallized intelligence increases with age because as we get older, we accumulate more knowledge. We have a greater vocabulary. We know more. Fluid intelligence is what tends to decline as we get older. This is how quick we are. How fast can we learn a new computer program or learn how to play a new video game? Okay, how fast can we solve new or novel problems? That type of intelligence will start to decline. Crystallize will actually increase. So this really kind of affects, when we talk about cross-sectional and longitudinal studies, that kind of affects the outcome. Well, are we testing your crystallized or your fluid intelligence? So we'll talk about those in chapter 9 more, and I'll bring this up again. But make sure you know the difference in crystallized and fluid intelligence as well. Okay, I have kept you long enough. I am sorry. I know this was long, but there's a lot of important information from chapter 7. So thank you if you watch this. I appreciate you listening, and I hope to see most of your faces tonight on Google Meet. So have a great day.